After America is made on the lands of the Kire-Wurrung, Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. The longest federal government shutdown in US history is now over. After a few Democrats caved in the Senate, House Republicans used their slim majority to pass a funding bill.
The bill as amended is passed.
Overnight, the Senate officially passing a bill to reopen the government.
After the longest ever shutdown, federal workers are getting back on the job.
Today, we're sending a clear message that we will never give in to extortion, because that's what it was. They tried to extort. The Democrats tried to extort our country.
But the deal leaving many Democrats outraged because it does nothing to address the expiring Obamacare subsidies that the party spent weeks holding out on as a precondition for reopening the government.
Why is it not enough? Why is this not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good then?
It's not even good. I mean, there's no perfect and good here. It's caving.
When the Trump administration was under pressure after big election losses, a few key Democrats went back to their old trick of resisting Trump by giving him everything he wants. This all started after Republicans refused Democrats' demand that they extend tax breaks for health insurance. But after 43 days of shutdown, Democrats got nothing. As Liz Pancotti told us on the show a few weeks ago, this will mean already appallingly high healthcare costs will go through the roof. Many Americans won't be able to afford this increase in their premiums. Some will just go without. In an all too familiar pattern, the richest country on earth keeps getting sicker and more unequal. But don't worry, Trump is making Ozempic cheaper. To talk about how the Democrats are once again cooking it and much more, we're really pleased to welcome back Charlie Lewis. Charlie is Crikey's reporter at large, who focuses on politics, culture, history, and the United States. He's also the co-host of Spin Cycle on Triple R Radio in Melbourne. Charlie, welcome back to the show. It's so lovely to see you again.
It's so lovely to be back. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. How are you doing? You've been firing off articles almost every day. How are you coping?
Yeah, that is the reality of a small but agile publication like Crikey. You have to file pretty much every day, but I'd rather file every day for them than for someone else. Yeah, for sure. And hopefully we can get to a bit of a discussion of the media more broadly and how it's covering Trump. But before we do that, of course, the Democrats in the US are coming off the back of some big election victories that you've written about. But it also looks like they are kind of back at their old tricks, opposing Trump by giving him everything that he wants. The longest federal government shutdown in US history is now over. The funding bills have passed, but Democrats didn't get any concessions, as far as I can tell, on healthcare, which was the issue that started this in the first place. What are they doing, Charlie? Well, when you find out, you might want to tell them, because I'm not sure that they know. I mean, I always look forward to coming on and chatting with you about this, but I was particularly interested to get your take on what's kind of transpired in the last week, because it seems to me that they could not have played it worse. As you say, they came off some very impressive election results the Tuesday before last in very diverse places as well, in Virginia and New York and other places. That was in the midst of this long government shutdown, as you say. So it does indicate that the voters weren't particularly keen to punish them for it. And indeed, the polling generally did seem to agree that voters largely blamed the Republicans for it. So you'd have to say that the Democrats were working with a fairly strong hand at this stage. And as you said, the fight was largely around extensions to healthcare subsidies that were going to run out at the end of the year. They've reopen the government without securing anything in that area, except the commitment to have another vote on it, which we presumably know how the Republicans are going to vote on that matter. So yes, there's a lot of blame to go around with this as well, because the reporting, which I think is actually quite generous to the Democrats, says that 7 Democratic senators and an independent who caucuses with the Democrats split with their party is the way that it often gets reported. But it seems pretty clear from the reporting that I've been reading that Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, was fully aware of what they were negotiating and they were doing it with basically his approval. So his decision to then vote against the reopening of the government seems disingenuous at best, incoherent at worst. And of course, the other point I made in the piece that I've written about it is that for all the complaints that the Democratic senators who didn't vote to reopen the government made, they had limited resistance that they could mount, but they didn't even do the token gesture of, for example, they granted unanimous consent, which is the process by which the parties agree to kind of suspend debates and fast-track legislation through. If you really were as furious as a lot of them are saying they are about their colleagues caving in this way, they could have at least made it a bit more difficult to pass that legislation. So not a huge amount of glory to go around in this particular instance.
No, I think that is that's even putting it a little bit kindly. Do you think, Charlie, that, I mean, is this part of that bigger like battle for the soul of the Democratic Party where they still haven't figured out amongst themselves how to oppose Trump, or they're still fighting amongst themselves over how to oppose Trump? And I mean, you mentioned Chuck Schumer there. He seems to be, I don't know, is he struggling with this in the way that, you know, he refused to endorse Mamdani? He's not kind of reining in those Democrats who are supporting Trump. Is this part of that bigger fight, do you think? I
suppose it's sort of almost by definition, everything that they do in this term of government is them working out how best to combat Trump. And I think, I talked a bit about the Mamdani result and how it's certainly significant in many ways, but you don't want to overplay the idea that gameplay works in every context. Mamdani won because he was an extraordinary candidate running a pitch that would work well for the group of people he was trying to get to elect him. So I think there is the temptation to say, well, you know, that's the future for the Democrats, and that's exactly how they have to play it from here on in. And I think there's a lot that they can take from that, obviously, and a huge emphasis on positivity rather than mere defense is, I think, one thing that would be very, very important to take from that. What's significant about Schumer is he really does seem very confused about the whole process and very keen to roll over. Obviously, there was a threatened shutdown quite early after Trump returned to office in March, and Schumer ensured that didn't happen.
Today is election day in New York City. Did you vote for Mamdani or Cuomo?
Look, I voted, and I look forward to working with the next mayor to help New York City.
The inability to even confirm that he voted for Zoran Mamdani after what was such an incredible campaign, no matter what you think of the guy's politics, was an incredible, I hesitate to call it a battle because it's almost like you're fighting success. It's an anti-achievement. It's opposing any kind of sense of momentum or cohesion in your party. To not even be able to say, look, I have my differences with the guy and I don't think his program is going to work everywhere is failure afresh. And it does worry me. And I think this last week has shown that perhaps I was right to be worried.
I think definitely right to be worried. We're always worried though, aren't we?
Yeah.
Worrying times. I wonder, I've seen some, I guess, hot takes, Charlie, on the election, really arguing that, you know, the result in New York City, when you put that alongside the result in, you know, a very different place like Virginia, or even some of the kind of lower level election results in places like Georgia or Pennsylvania, almost suggest that it doesn't matter if Democrats can't get their shit together, like being not Trump might just be enough. I mean, I'm skeptical of that, but that is, I guess, one conclusion that we can draw out of the results. Is it enough to just not be Trump, given how deeply unpopular he is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And of course, that is a little bit the rhythm of US politics, kind of going back quite long, basically for as long as I've been following it. You will have even a very, very comprehensive victory like the one that Trump enjoyed or the one that Obama enjoyed in 2008. And then by the time the midterms come around, they can't live up to the kind of soaring rhetoric, or I don't think you'd call Trump's rhetoric soaring, but, you know, the promises that they made. And, you know, there's a huge flip in the Senate and the House, and then suddenly they can't even get their programs through. It's an interesting one that maybe Trump saw that potential coming, and that's why him and his administration have been so, for that first 6 months, I mean, that really was, there was that sense that we were dealing with something entirely new there, I thought, when it wasn't a bored billionaire who got into office out of spite and didn't really know what to do with it. There was a very, very targeted program in terms of installing loyalists in security services and the media regulators and things like that, getting through their, again, with a lot of help from the Democrats and unanimous consent, getting a lot of their appointments through really, really quickly. Maybe hoping to have a bit of a bulwark against what's kind of to come when it all starts to fall apart. And that actually probably does point to the one potential strategy I can discern from caving on the government shutdown without securing an extension to the healthcare subsidies, is that's what the Democrats have identified as an issue that they do quite well on, that they will be able to campaign on quite strongly. And it actually does them some good if 20-odd million people suddenly can't afford to pay for their healthcare. They don't want to neutralize that issue in the lead up to the 2026 midterms. It's very bad policy, but it may end up being politically astute. Again, if people blame the Democrats for the fact that their premiums have gone up, then of course it's all for nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, Charlie, that you raise that question of, the cycles of US politics, because this election result absolutely, falls into that familiar pattern. But that also raises that perpetual question as well about, can we consider this a normal US election cycle?
I have 24 Trump 2028 hats. His folks keep sending me.
And you think he's going to run again?
Who spends $200 million on a ballroom at their home and then leaves the house?
Well, he's going to get a third term. So Trump 28, Trump is going to be president in 28, and people just ought to get accommodated with that.
Based on what I read, I guess I'm not allowed to run. So we'll see what happens.
Johnson says you're trolling when you talk about a third term.
Well, I don't think he said that. I don't think he'd use that term, but it's a very interesting thing. I have the best numbers for any president in many years, any president. And I would say that if you read it, it's pretty clear. I'm not allowed to run. It's too bad. I mean, it's stupid.
You also wrote a piece in the last couple of weeks about just that, about the evidence that Trump is going to attempt to hang around, and that his administration and his attacks against the institutions of American democracy are really worryingly, to go back to the theme, worryingly effective. And that piece took us back into the history of Trump talking about rigging elections and how this isn't new. Could you just kind of, I guess, take us through that? Because I think it's so important to emphasize, that this isn't normal. And I don't think we can really talk about normal electoral cycles now at the moment in the States.
It's a really good point. Yes. Trump wouldn't have accepted the 2016 result had it gone against him. Trump didn't accept the 2020 election result that went against him. Why would we have any reason to believe that when it comes to the end of his term, that all his comments about wanting a third term and the fact that he probably could do it, why would we think for a second that that's not exactly what he plans to do? And I suppose I think the point that I made in that piece was that if it's up to the Republicans, he'll be able to do it. I think I don't see there being any there'll be a political solution to that problem if they have their way. And I suppose that does kind of chime with the kind of figure that Trump has become in the Republican Party that I don't think other politicians, certainly not progressive ones, have ever been able to do, which is the idea that the party has now entirely distorted itself to fit with his image. A figure like Obama would find, or Biden as well, they found that the more conservative end of their party would prevaricate and wouldn't always be on their side and would distance themselves from their policies if they felt that it wasn't going to work for their base. But also, these guys are political lifers. A president will come, a president will go. But if you want to stay in Congress or in the Senate, you've got donors to keep happy. A constant cycle. That won't be a problem for Republicans as long as they've got Trump to keep them popular. There's no obvious, I say popular, but to keep them in power. There's no obvious successor to Trump. There never has been. Anyone who's tried, the most famous one, the one that we were all really worried about for 6 months in 2023 was obviously Ron DeSantis, who was supposed to be Trump, but with
I forgot about him.
Yeah, and that was going to. I remember that was a real worry for people who didn't like the Republicans. They were like, "Oh God, it's the whole idea was Trump, but with an attention span. Trump who can get some stuff done. It turns out that's not what people want. It turned out to be Trump without a sense of humor, without any of his like grimy charisma, which is actually what people seem to really like about him. So you can't replace that. So it's in everyone in the Republican Party's interests to sort of stop him from having to leave office, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, while they think they can use him, while Stephen Miller types and, Project 2025 types are finding him very useful, yeah, I think you're right. They will continue to support him, despite the fact that he is historically unpopular, as are their policies. We know they're not particularly worried about winning people over in that sense. But it does seem that they are at least a little bit rattled by those election results. There's been a bit of infighting, I guess, in the kind of MAGA universe. Am I stretching it too far to say that Trump's having a little bit of trouble setting the narrative in the way that he usually does? Partly because of these election results, but also because of the ever-present Epstein stuff. He can't make it go away.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think, as you say, this is the first time probably he's gone as long as he has without being able to easily shift the dial and get people talking about other things. In fact, they are now, Caroline Leavitt was complaining, I think it was just today, that they were using the line that everyone uses about Trump, but they were saying that the Epstein files are just a distraction from the fact that the Democrats caved on the government shutdown, and that's that's what it is, which is kind of funny. And I think again, it does point not to, well, actually no, why not? Let's keep hammering the Democrats about this. It is one of the points that makes the cave this week feel so contemptible, is that Tim Kaine, the Virginia senator who obviously ran for vice president with Hillary Clinton in 2016, he was one of the figures that kind of negotiated the end of the shutdown. And he wrote a piece in the New York Times sort of trying to explain himself. And all I could get out of the piece was all the reasons he listed that they shouldn't have done it. So he said that the first time that the White House came to meaningfully engage in these negotiations was after the election results on Tuesday. Within 2 days of those election results, they were having meetings talking about whether they should just stop the shutdown. The fact that he also pointed out, yes, that the polling was showing that people were holding the Republicans more responsible for this than the Democrats, and he points out that they did well in those elections. All of which does point to the fact, again, I'll talk to him blue in the face about this, that they probably should not have caved. But as you say, that doesn't change the fact that, yes, Trump is actually struggling a little bit, I think, to control the narrative in the last couple of weeks. He's having to be a bit more on the defensive. And the Epstein files are the one time that's really, really happened. I think the election stuff and the shutdown would have eventually cleared.
Yeah.
He would have gotten away with that. But the kind of people who voted him in because he promised to reveal things like the Epstein files, because he posited, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, a kind of vast conspiracy of sexual deviants who were like sucking the country dry, and then suddenly there is what appears to be fairly solid evidence to the fact that there may have been some truth to that, and it turns out that as a lifelong member of the elite, he is quite entangled in those files. So it's an interesting one, because you go, did he just think it was never going to come out that he was in this, or did he think he could style it out? I don't know. But as you say, it's not going to go away. It's inexhaustible. And even if every fleck of evidence that is in to the extent that there are Epstein files, if they are ever made entirely public, the kind of people who are fixated on this thing will never think that it's all been revealed, especially at this stage, especially with this level of equivocation and delay on the matter. It's going to make him look more and more complicit as time goes on.
Yeah, well, I mean, even the headlines this week around the release of more of those emails seem, quite muted about the evidence that Trump knew. I think you can probably draw some stronger conclusions out of those emails. And you're right, it's not going to go away. I mean, I don't think that will necessarily be fatal to Trump. Like it hasn't been yet. And we shouldn't underestimate his ability to kind of weave his way out of these crises.
Yes.
And I mean, he is also, of course, engaged in his usual tactics around that, as you mentioned, calling it a hoax, focusing on the shutdown. And he's also continuing his attacks on the media.
The BBC has apologised to President Trump for a panorama episode on the events of January the 6th, which spliced parts of his speech together.
We'll sue them for anywhere between $1 billion and $5 billion, probably sometime next week. Say it ready, when I think I have to do it. I mean, they've even admitted that they cheated.
The BBC has no plans to rebroadcast the documentary Trump: A Second Chance on any BBC platforms. And while the BBC sincerely regrets the manner in which the video clip was edited, we strongly disagree there is a basis for a defamation claim.
Because he's threatening to sue the BBC, again, over January 6th coverage, something else he just can't let go.
That, to me, actually, that whole saga strikes me as having a bit more to do with internal British politics than it does Trump particularly. I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
My view is that Trump's part in all this is actually fairly tangential. I think that's got much more to do with the ongoing attacks on the BBC from conservative politicians and media figures. Is my kind of take from a glancing look at it, is that figures on the BBC board, one of whom was previously British Prime Minister Theresa May's chief of staff, really pushed for a review by a former News Corp journalist called Michael Prescott to kind of review the so-called bias at the BBC. The most notorious thing that he uncovered was this episode of Panorama, which actually I have to be honest, I think did quite shabby journalism with Trump's January 6th speech, where it spliced together two sentences that were about an hour apart in the speech. And put them together and made it, and did very much give the indication that he had directly incited the crowd in a way that objectively he hadn't. As I say, I think it was not just that it was shabby and misleading; it was unnecessary. We all know the role that Trump played in whipping up that crowd. Yeah. You didn't have to doctor anything to make your point about that day. But that screened before he was reelected, and it didn't. I don't believe it even screened in the US. So any idea that it had any damaging impact on him is a pretty hard one to stand up, I would say, because that does happen a bit with Trump, where people will tell him something bad has been done to him, and he'll say, "Well, I'm sending that person to prison," and then it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, the hilarity of the recurring stuff with our former Prime Minister and current Ambassador Kevin Rudd, where our News Corp journalists keep forcing Trump to remember who he is and say, "Oh, he said terrible things about you," and Trump pretends that he knows what's going on and says, "Oh yeah, well, I'll probably fire him because he's, and of course he's not going to." I do wonder if that's kind of more the dynamic at play here, that this is actually something that is about the Daily Telegraph in particular, but the kind of the conservative media in the UK, who has long hated the BBC in the same way that it does the ABC in Australia, and has long run a campaign to discredit it. I think it probably has more to do with those dynamics than this being like a first and foremost Trump story.
Yeah, sure. I think you're absolutely right, and it's so interesting is not the word, but seeing those networks, those right wing and conservative networks, particularly in the media, and the way that they link up so cleverly is really quite something. The way they allow Trump to put pressure on foreign media is quite extraordinary. For those networks to facilitate Trump threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion, or, to facilitate the way he verbally attacked the Australian reporter John Lyons, for example, is really something. How do you see the global media like that and its response to Trump? Like, the BBC has apologised to Trump for that Panorama episode, and it sounds like, maybe that was warranted. But do you think there's still a broader problem with how the media is responding to Trump and kind of allowing him to get away with these threats?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's been the issue kind of all along, hasn't it? It's been no one knows within the kind of the legacy media and the kind of the establishment, when someone so flagrantly breaks every rule of kind of decency and civility, the things that we were supposed to really cherish, and it doesn't matter. Well, no, not just actually decency and civility. That was the first reason that everyone was really worried about Trump. It was, and then of course it became his inability to govern, his inability to maintain friendships with anyone for long enough to kind of run a government, A, B, or C. Then obviously the fact that he didn't really believe that elections mattered all that much. all of that should be disqualifying for, and would be for any other candidate. So the media, I think, if anything, it's in a worse position than it was the first time around, because all the major kind of American networks and publications became, part of the hashtag resistance, and everyone added nice slogans to their paper, and it kind of worked. They all got the there was the Trump bump. Everyone kind of started paying for news again for a bit, and it was now obviously we've seen a real retreat from that in the current administration. We've seen many big papers, the Washington Post most strikingly, not endorse a candidate at all. We saw the owner of Jeff Bezos of the Washington Post at the inauguration. Obviously, various networks have been sued by Trump and have basically rolled over and settled rather than fight on what they had quite strong. You have quite strong protections against defamation law in the US that you don't have in Australia. They probably would have won if they'd fought it out. So all of this suggests that they are kind of attuned to the new reality. They are accustomed to it, which is in some ways, yes, even worse than the slightly smug pontificating that we got the first time around. At least they were up for the fight then, I guess.
I don't know. I think you can still find that smug pontificating in the New York Times sometimes.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, there's never a shortage of that. That's true.
You mentioned there, Charlie, the breaking of rules and the shattering of norms. And I want to use that to jump to something slightly different, because it was the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam dismissal last week. And you wrote a really fantastic piece on questions about CIA involvement or not in that dismissal, which, allegations of which, of course, have swirled around this for a really long time. Obviously, there's so much to get into here, but your piece summarized it beautifully. Can you just, I guess, tell us a little bit about what evidence there is for CIA covert involvement in the Whitlam dismissal? We can put our tinfoil hats on now while we talk about it.
Yes. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say, and also a seamless transition.
Thank you.
As soon as you were like, we were talking there about the shattering of norms, I'm like, oh, I know what's coming here. Yeah. I mean, it is a really interesting and, I guess, tantalizing subplot to this, huge political crisis. That's probably the biggest scandal that we've had in Australian politics. There are a lot of reasons why people kind of have come to the conclusion that there was either explicit or at the very least tacit endorsement from US security services for the ousting of Gough Whitlam on November 11, 1975. By the standards of Australia, but certainly by the standards of the US at the time, Gough Whitlam ran a very, very left-wing government, a very reforming left-wing government. And I guess among the ways that he had come to slightly put the Americans on edge, at the very least, to say his government and he privately had criticized some of the US's conduct in the Vietnam War at the time. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of talk of edging Australia much more towards the non-aligned movement rather than being a third path through the Cold War kind of politics. The thing that really kicked it off with the US was, there was two things. Gough Whitlam's government raided the ASIO headquarters at the time because they felt that they were dragging their feet on investigating right-wing terrorism in the country, which made the US feel that we weren't necessarily the most reliable partner to have in terms of intelligence sharing. But the major thing was that there is the Pine Gap, what was euphemistically called a space research center, but it's a surveillance area in the Northern Territory, very, very key to US intelligence gathering at that time and to this day, and increasingly explicitly, very obviously militarily focused. There's some that it's been sort of suggested that at the time, because it was relatively new at the time, it was less than a decade old at this stage, and Australians in general, and potentially Whitlam himself, didn't know quite how key it was to the US aims at the time. So during one particularly forthright conversation he was having with the US ambassador at the time, a guy called Walter Rice, he said, if you try and screw us on a policy matter, then Pine Gap becomes part of the equation. The renewal was coming up a month after the dismissal. So the threat that he might actually not renew that agreement was obviously hugely, hugely consequential to America's intelligence needs. So that's the context, I guess, for why people think, well, there's an interest there. I think probably anyone who's serious about looking into the dismissal does say that would have been a consideration for Kerr. And the question is, to John Kerr, the Governor General at the time, who so sensationally dismissed the Whitlam government. The controversy obviously comes down to, well, how actively applied was that pressure? And there's a few little kind of tantalizing details that have been floating around in history that indicate maybe reasonably active. There's been great work done by James Curran and Brian Toohey, particularly looking at this area, and I would commend everyone who understand this a great deal more than I do, and I should defer to them on most of the details. So there was a man who worked for a company called TRW, which is a contractor to the CIA, who helped break their codes, who later in his life told, I believe it was John Pilger, that he had heard CIA officers refer to Sir John Kerr as our man Kerr. And there was also another CIA operative who had helped set up Pine Gap called Victor Marchetti, who had told John Pilger that the threat to close Pine Gap caused apoplexy in the White House and a kind of Chile coup was set in motion, which is pretty explicit. And I think that's the other thing to really consider in terms of the context, is that this is what America was doing quite a lot of at the time, often in far more violent and explicit ways than they did here. Chile is the obvious one, Guatemala, 100 different countries were sort of interfered with in this way. My favorite of the, that's interesting details that are kind of floating around in history is the accounts of a meeting in 1977, so a few years after, between Whitlam's private secretary, Richard Butler, and the then US Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, who was Deputy Secretary of State under, at that time, the newly elected President, Jimmy Carter. He told, apparently, Whitlam that he'd been instructed to relay certain messages, and one of them was that the US would never again interfere in the domestic political processes of Australia. They didn't elaborate, and I believe Carter has since been asked about that, and he said, "Look, I have no evidence of anything." So again, it remains vague, but there are plenty of reasons to suspect that there was some involvement of some sort, and it certainly couldn't have displeased them when what happened. And I think also it's really worth looking at the Labour Party in particular since that period. And you have figures like, Bob Hawke, who was actually an intelligence asset for the Americans in the 70s. That's often forgotten. No one's ever gone anywhere near the US relationship in that way, well, in government anyway, from the Labour side, which is interesting. And obviously that continues to this day. Albanese has deeply entrenched us with the US for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the relaying of that message from Carter seems very significant to me, for that to come from the most wholesome of the US presidents, especially, after Nixon and particularly the context of the CIA is significant, if nothing else. It is a mess, though. You're right. There are tantalizing bits of evidence, and that context is so important, I think, in Chile. But of course, we have a lot of evidence about what the United States was doing in Chile in the way that we just don't when it comes to Australia. I suspect if we ever do, it will probably come from the United States and not from Australian records. You've experienced how difficult it is to get information out of Australian archives and the Australian government around this, but certainly one that we will keep watching, and we're really grateful for the way that you wade through all of that detail and translate it when there is so much and it's so hard to get it right. So we really appreciate that and your time and your generosity as always, Charlie. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. You can find all of the Australia Institute's research on the Australia-US relationship and much more via our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 14th of November. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.